Hello, and welcome to another day of the Internet Measurement Village. Well, and actually, it's the last day.
Aww.
But joining us today, we're so glad to have Rama from the IODA project, and he's going to be telling us all about examining Internet blackouts through open data. Thanks for joining us today, Rama.
My pleasure, Arturo. Thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks to all who have joined. I hope you're all keeping safe during these difficult times, and I'm really grateful that you all found the time to join us for this presentation. So I'm guessing that many of you are already familiar with IODA, but for those who are not, IODA is a system with a public dashboard that monitors the internet around the world 24/7 to measure internet outages, that is, events where users experience complete disconnection from the internet. Note that we are not talking here about partial shutdowns where users are unable to access specific websites such as Twitter or Facebook, but are actually able to access other websites. There are other great tools like Uni and Sensor Planet that take a look at such partial shutdowns. IODA is instead focused upon complete internet shutdowns, such as the one that occurred in Iran last November, where a significant portion of the users in the country had no internet connectivity at all. So the focus of the talk today is to show how you can use IODA to detect episodes of internet shutdowns, how to interpret the signals in IODA, including potential pitfalls, and then we'll go over some case studies, some that I've chosen, and any that you would like to look into. So please, if there are specific case studies that you'd like to look into, just please add them in the chat. Also, I should note, so this presentation is not really a presentation. It has no slides. It'll be a live demo with hopefully a lot of audience participation. So I really hope that the demo gods will be kind to me today. All right, okay, so let's start with the use case that I often have when using IODA for detecting shutdowns. So there was recently an email on the Keep It On mailing list that said, hey, there are rumors that there is an internet shutdown in Ethiopia. Is this true? So how would we begin? We'd first go to, if you want to look into this shutdown and see if what IODA has to say, go to ioda.caida.org. And again, so I've explained what IODA is. IODA is the Internet Outage Detection and Analysis system. And CAIDA is the research center that's affiliated with UC San Diego, where IODA is actively under development. So CAIDA, which stands for the Center for Applied Internet Data Analysis, it builds infrastructure to perform large-scale internet measurements and makes curated data available to other researchers, political scientists, policymakers, and the general public. Now, the idea behind IODA was actually conceived in 2011 when researchers at CAIDA, when they'd studied large shutdown events in Egypt and Libya during the Arab Spring. So back in the day, it took us several months to obtain all that data and crunch through it and complete the investigation of these shutdowns. But in the time since, we've been able to build a system, IODA, that is capable of monitoring the internet 24/7 and detects internet outages due to shutdowns and other causes such as power outages. And it does this monitoring for countries, regions, and networks from around the world. And it does so in near real time. What's more, its data is available publicly and anybody can access it. Okay, so we were interested in whether there is a shutdown in Ethiopia on June 30. So let's look at the overview dashboard. So clicking on that link takes us to the overview dashboard, where we see by default, within the last 24 hours, so a day ago to now, which countries around the world have ongoing internet outages as detected by IODA. Now you'll see that these countries have different colors. So the redder a country, the more red a country, the more severe the outage that IODA has detected in that country. And in the table to the right, you can see the alert feed, which is a list of outages that IODA has automatically detected, ordered by severity. Now let's take a look at the last 7 days, not just the last 24 hours, but at the last 7 days. And we'll see that Ethiopia is actually indeed over here. So let's, if we click on the link, so each of these is a clickable link. And when we actually click on this link, it's going to show us the different time series signals from each of IODA's data sources for Ethiopia. So IODA uses 3 different data sources for its signals, and I'm going to briefly walk over these. Each time series signal over here represents one of these data sources. So let's begin with the active probing data source. So for now, I'm just going to double click this particular source so that it will show me, it'll allow you to see what I'm talking, which particular signal that I'm talking about. The active probing data source represents ping response data from networks all around the world. From machines under our control, we continuously ping millions of networks on the internet. And intuitively, networks that are responding to our pings, they have working internet connectivity. But if several networks in a country suddenly stop responding to our pings, we may have found an outage. The BGP data source represents routing information, well, global routing information that each router in the internet exchanges with other routers. As you know, internet packets from one part of the internet reach other parts by going through several routers along the way. These routers continuously communicate with each other on what the best routes are to various destinations using an internet protocol called BGP. So by monitoring this BGP communication, IODA assesses when there is a significant reduction in the number of destinations that can be reached within a country, such as over here, where the number of destinations that were reachable, that are visible in BGP, there is a significant drop. Then there is the last data source is the Darknet data source, and this is actually the most esoteric of our data sources. I will first begin by noting that it has nothing to do with the dark web. Internally, we actually call this data source Internet Background Radiation, or just IBR. But for now, I'm going to continue to call it the Darknet data source because that's what it's called in IODA. But I'll reiterate that Darknet has nothing to do with dark web. The Darknet data source represents liveness traffic that is often from actual user machines. This background noise traffic is sourced by millions of machines worldwide and is often a result of these machines being infected by malware, or they could be conducting some kind of scanning activity. Thanks to infrastructure at CAIDA, we're able to see a portion of this internet background noise traffic. And this traffic is able to give us a liveness signal that's actually collected from user machines. Again, IODA's intuition is that when there is a significant drop in the time series from IBR, it could be due to a potential outage. Right? And so IODA uses these 3 different complementary signals to detect outages. And the reason why we use these 3 different signals is because depending upon the nature of the outage, it may either be visible in all 3, or it may only be visible on some subset of these. For example, in this outage, we already observed that the BGP outage, it's supposed to have lasted only for a very short duration. So I'll also call out that all of these signals have currently been normalized to lie between 0 and 1. But what you can see is that the BGP data source, it went down, it dropped nearly to 0, but then this period of time itself, it lasted for a short time. Whereas in active probing, the outage apparently is still continuing. So there was a significant drop on June 30th, corresponding to the time when the email was received on the keep it on list. And since then, many of the networks have still not recovered to the traffic levels that we were seeing before. Right? And this sort of highlights the complementary nature of these data sources. We see that same thing in the Darknet data source as well. Okay, let's take a look at one more outage that was visible in the last 7 days, because it also serves as a great case study. So let's take a look at the Syrian Arab Republic. Again, so we're in the dashboard page. If you click on this, we're going to go to the page that's displaying the signals specifically for Syria. So as you can see on the right, this is the automatically generated list of outages of potential outages that IODA has detected. And we observed that it has detected quite a few during this time. And let's zoom in. There seem to have been quite a few events that IODA has detected. Let's zoom in on one of these. So to zoom, I'm just going to click and drag in the area that I wish to zoom. And that will take me to the case that I want to zoom. And then I can reset zoom to get out. So let's come back here. What you'll see here, I can actually zoom in a little further. This outage, this began in all three of the data sources. So in BGP, in active probing, and in the Darknet, roughly around 1 a.m. in UTC. So this is not local time. Again, this is UTC. What we'll see here is that the next outage, this also began at around 1 a.m. in UTC. Now, Syria has had a history. There have been documented instances where Syria has been known, the Syrian government has been known to shut down the internet every year during school exam times to prevent cheating. So, and we saw a particular timing pattern that appeared in these two outages. What we can do now is let's look at a similar time period last year to see if this timing pattern was observed in outages from last year as well. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to specify a different time range. So not just looking at the last 7 days, but say if I want to look at June in 2019 or July in 2019. So I'll go to July 2019 and then click the start time. And note that in IODA, in the public dashboard, there is a limit on one specific month at a time. There's a maximum limit of 1 month at a time that you can access data for. Note that this period, this 1 month can be any month. It can be any given month. It could be all of June 2020. It could be all of July 2019, all the way back until 2030. But let's take a look at July 2019. So I'm going to hit apply. And since we've asked for quite a lot of data, this graph may actually take a little bit of time to load. Okay, and what we see here is that right towards the end of July, there are 4 episodes where it looks like all 3 of the data sources, they nearly dropped to 0. Let's zoom in again and look at the timing patterns. What we see here, again, this happened. So if I hover over one of these signals, it shows me that the time when this occurred was 1 a.m., which is similar to the time that we're observing for the outages that we just observed in the last week too. Let's take a look at another of these. Again, it's July 29th, 1 a.m. And this is July 30th, 1 a.m. So in this way, okay, let's go back to what we're looking at over the last week. So this way, by looking at the timing patterns between the previous known shutdown and between these potential, these outages, it's possible to say that, okay, this is consistent with these exam-related shutdowns that the Syrian government has been known to carry out in the past. So, okay, now let's take, suppose that we have some other event that we're interested in. So, for example, the large shutdown event in Iran that we want to investigate. And so again, that was a very well documented, complete internet shutdown event, which was reported on in the news media. Let's look at IODA data and see how it appears. Let's go to IODA, go again to the overview dashboard. And now let's specify Iran in the country. And let's set the date range to be in November of last year. So the outage occurred roughly, I believe, on November 16th. So let's look for a week before and after November 16th. So let's say 10th until November 2019, say the 24th. Then hit apply. And again, since this is a 2-week period, it's going to be a little bit of a wait as IODA loads the data. And also, I should mention, so as we're doing these case studies, if you have other case studies that we would like to look into, I'd be delighted to go over those. Okay, so what we see here is the internet was relatively stable in the lead up to 16th November. And then on 16th November, you can see there's a drop in all 3 of IODA's data sources. The drop in BGP is not as large, but whereas the drop in the active probing and Darknet data sources, so active probing, it drops nearly to 0. Darknet also, it drops, it has a significant drop. BGP, on the other hand, doesn't have as significant a drop. But so this happened roughly on November 16th. And then around 24th of November, we start to see these, we observe that the shutdown slowly, there seems to be slow recovery. Now, IODA actually doesn't just detect outages at the granularity of an entire country. It also does so at the granularity of regions. So it's possible to look at regional outages for Iran. That is, how did this particular outage, how are the different regions within Iran affected? Note, however, that there is a little bit of, we need to take these regional results with a pinch of salt. This is because identifying outages at the regional granularity, for doing that, we rely on these geolocation databases, such as NetAcuity and MaxMind. And these outages, and these databases can sometimes have inaccuracies. For example, especially in a country like Iran, they may actually place a lot of the addresses in Iran right in the capital. And so it's possible that we just observe many of these addresses enter Iran. But you'll see when this infographic eventually loads that this particular outage, it actually affected quite a few regions in Iran. Okay, so now we've shown the ability of IODA we looked at the ability of IODA to look at regional outages. It's also possible to look at outages of ASs, which are networks, so autonomous systems, which is jargon essentially for individual networks in Iran. And I'm just going to grab a quick sip of water as this loads. What you see here on the right is the list of autonomous systems for which IODA automatically detected an outage. And again, like before, clicking on one of these ASs, it's going to now zoom in to the signals just for this particular AS. So this is for AS 58224, Iran Telecommunication Company, which is one of the largest internet service providers in Iran. So we see for AS 58224 for ITC, Iran Telecommunication Company, all 3 data sources. So BGP, there's a significant drop at around 1800. So November 16, 1800. Similarly, for active probing, the drop happens at the same time, and it's also very steep and sharp. And for Darknet also, there is some diurnal patterns as you would expect. Since it's composed of actual user traffic, where as users, as they sleep, the traffic reduces, and then as they wake up, it increases. But over here, there is a really, really, really steep fall that aligns with the other data sources as well. Right. Now, let's take a look at another AS, but for the same time period. Actually, let's focus on the start time of this shutdown, because of this outage, because we found some interesting patterns in how ASs were affected by this particular outage. So let's zoom in on, say, just the beginning period of the shutdown, so between 16th to 17th of November. So let's click 16th November, 17th, and apply. All right. So what we see here is the data that's zoomed in just for this period, or on the 16th of November, the day that the outage started. Now let's copy this link and open a new tab and paste it. So by default, it's just going to show us the exact same, the same as before, as you would expect. But let's now change the AS. Let's look for a different network in Iran. So let's look at Iran Telecommunication Company. There's a different AS that's also Iran Tele. Oops, if only I can spell. Company AS 12880. Of course, if all the demos were to work perfectly, that would be amazing. Okay, I'm just going to, I know the AS number for this AS that I'm interested in. So yes, I was looking for, oh, it's Information Technology Company. No wonder. Okay, but let's look at, so this is another large AS in Iran. Let's look at this for the same time period. Let's look at how the IODA signals were affected. And you'll see one stark difference and some similarities. So similar to the previous AS, the outage itself seems to have begun at around the same time, November 16th at 6 p.m. And here also, November 16th, right around 6 p.m. is when the outage appears to have occurred in 2 of the data sources. So this outage is visible in the Darknet data source. It's visible in active probing. But BGP, there doesn't seem to have been anything at the time that the outage actually began. There does seem to be something like a minor blip over here, but there doesn't seem to have been anything over here. However, we do know from other sources that even users within this particular AS, they were actually affected by this outage event. And so this is an example where the complementary data sources of IODA are helping us to determine that, okay, there was actually an outage, but it did, due to the way that it manifested, due to the mechanism that is potentially used, it appears in 2 of the data sources, but not in the 3rd. Okay, so now we looked at these AS level differences in which signals were affected, but let's also, I'll highlight one of the differences in how the timing patterns of these signals shows us some evidence on perhaps the government orders that were issued to these different networks. So this is because these 2 networks, so AS 58224 and AS 12880, they are fixed line networks, and they tended to have outages that began at 6 p.m. But if we look at a few hours before, so from 12 onwards to 17, and let me do that over here too. If you look at a few hours before, we'll notice that there isn't as much of an outage that begins. Definitely there doesn't seem to be anything before 3 p.m. for either of these networks. But now let's look at a cellular network. So again, I'll do the same thing. I'm going to copy this link and I'm going to paste it here. So by default, it'll show me the same signals for AS12880. But now I'm going to look for a large cellular network. This is called Iran Cell, and this time it's going to work. Yay, it worked. So if I look at that same time range, but for Iran Cell, you'll notice here that the outage began much earlier. So the outage began around 2 p.m. over here for Iran Cell. And this is different from the outages that seem to begin around 6 p.m. in these other 2 ASs. And therefore, by looking at these different ASs, by the ability that IODA gives us to do these AS level analysis, it's possible to perhaps uncover the sequence of events that could have led to these outages, or at least it's consistent with the sequence of events where the government may have issued the order to the cellular providers to execute the shutdown a little earlier than perhaps the fixed line providers. All right, so far we've taken a look at the Ethiopia shutdown and Syria and Iran, where the shutdown was fairly clear. Let's now take a look at a slightly more complex shutdown, where there was news of of the shutdown event in Jammu and Kashmir. So Jammu and Kashmir is a region in India. There was news that there was news reports that there was a shutdown implemented in early August of 2019. So let's look at what the IODA data for that time has to say. So we would go to the overview dashboard. By now you're familiar, you probably know that I'm going to click on region, and I'm going to search for Jammu and Kashmir, which is the name of the region. And then I'm going to specify the date range that I'm interested in. So it's early August of 2019. So let me go to 2019. Okay, let's begin with July 28th of 2019. And since we can look at a maximum of 1 month, for now we'll just look at 2 weeks. So looking at 2 weeks of data in 2019 in Jammu and Kashmir, a region in India. And we're trying to see, was there evidence in IODA's time series signals that are consistent with a potential shutdown event? So what we see here, let's focus on the active tooling data source. So there is some fluctuation here, but there's one particular dip over here, which happened right around the time when the shutdown is supposed to have occurred on August 4th, which could indeed be consistent with a shutdown. Now let's take a look at the Darknet data source. The Darknet data source doesn't have as steep a fall as the active tooling data source, so there isn't as pronounced a drop. But what we see here is that in this normalized signal between 0 to 1, before the shutdown, there was more tidal variation, and the magnitude of the traffic at the highest point was much higher compared to the magnitude at the highest point after 4th of August, after this point, right? And so, again, on its own, if you were just looking at these signals without external context, maybe it is harder to interpret. But given the context that a known shutdown event is supposed to have occurred, these signals in IODA are actually giving us some indication that, okay, these signals are somewhat consistent with a potential shutdown that occurred in Jammu and Kashmir. Now, why didn't these signals drop all the way to 0? Well, it's possible that the shutdown did not affect every single machine in the region, but that maybe there was still some perhaps government machines which continued to be able to send traffic resulting in these signals not dropping all the way to 0. Okay, one thing that you'll notice here is that there's a gap in the BGP signal. So gaps like these, they actually they are not indicative of outages, but they're indicative of issues or problems on the infrastructure, on the IODA infrastructure end, where we're just missing this data. And the way to interpret these gaps is just, we can't do anything. We can't decide what happened during that time. The data is just completely missing. Okay, so this is one example of a shutdown, which it's sort of there. It's possible to see it in IODA, but it's not as crystal clear. But there are other larger pitfalls in IODA. So one specific pitfall is that we must remember that IODA detects internet outages, and these internet outages could also be due to other causes, such as massive power outages. So, for example, last year in Venezuela, in March, there was a really, really large power outage, not an internet shutdown event, just a power outage. And so let's take a look at that. So if I look at Venezuela and specify March of 2019, oops, not April, March 2019, I believe it happened on around the 11th or the 8th. Okay, so let's see, March 3rd to March 17th. Let's look at this 2-week period. And again, you can see that, okay, in the automated feeds, there seems to be a lot of data already. I would also, speaking about the alert feeds, there are, the system is continuously, we are continuously improving the system, which means that sometimes a lot of the times these alert feeds are accurate, but sometimes they may be inaccurate. So that's something to bear in mind as well. But coming over here, coming to Venezuela's graph, you can see that on the 7th of March at around 2000, it's a significant drop in both the Darknet and the active probing data source, which was when the first power outage actually happened. And then in the time since, every now and then, when there was partial recovery, but then there was one more outage. And this was because of a phenomenon called cascaded power outages, where when power was being restored, something else went wrong, and therefore that resulted in an outage again. But again, the key takeaway here, or the key thing that we should remember, is that IODA detects internet outages. This is an instance of an internet outage that is caused by a power outage, but which is not an instance caused by a government-mandated complete shutdown. Okay, so a few other pitfalls. So sometimes we observe that IODA was missing data, like in the case of Kashmir. So if there is a gap in a time series, then it just means that we don't know what happened, and it's inconclusive. A much rarer outage, but that does happen sometimes, is actually an outage on the infrastructure end. So sometimes, rarely, we have a power outage at CAIDA, which means that the machine from which we are sending pings to all the networks around the world, that machine itself may experience a failure, which means that it will look as though every single country and every single region and network have an outage. Of course, there is a simple way that we can test if a given outage is due to that behavior. For an outage, just look at a time series for different countries. For example, if we see an outage in Ethiopia, and we want to, if you also try to look at outages for the same period, say in the US, which is a completely different country, and there should be no reason why there's an outage that occurs together. Then, so in this case, it did not occur, which gives us a little more confidence that, okay, maybe this was something that happened in Ethiopia. But if we see a massive outage that's occurring across different aggregates, different unrelated aggregates, then it's likely that it's because of an infrastructure failure. One more pitfall is that sometimes IODA can detect false positives, especially in relatively small countries. So like in countries like St. Kitts and Nevis or St. Lucia, the signal from these small countries is somewhat weak. There aren't many networks, because the countries are small, there aren't many networks in those countries to begin with. So there is a lot of fluctuation in the magnitude of these signals. And therefore, IODA just tends to detect more false positives and false negatives in those countries as well. So when you see all of these, when you see this list of 25 25 outages, they're not necessarily all real internet outages. And that's something to keep in mind, especially in these smaller countries. One more pitfall to keep in mind, and this may be fairly advanced and may not be something that everybody understands, but it's still something to keep in mind. So sometimes these things called level shifts occur in the data. So let me give you an example of such a level shift. So this was for a cellular AS in Iran, MCCI, AS 197207. As you can see here, the active probing data source, it went from a state of 1 all the way to 0.04, and then it never recovered, right? But during the same time, nothing else seems to be happening in BGP. And although there seems to be some missing data, which again, as you recall, these gaps are just because of missing data, which are caused by infrastructure problems on our end, there does not seem to be an unusual drop in the Darknet signal or BGP. But there is a huge drop in active probing. Now, we took a look at this, and turns out that for some reason, the networks that used to respond to our pings, they simply stopped responding from this time onwards. And sometimes this can happen because the internet service provider, or the cellular provider in this case, they just reconfigure the networks to not respond to pings. Again, that's not an outage, but it does look like a drop in our signal. So a rule of thumb when using IODA to detect outages is to look for outages in at least 2 data sources which occur at similar times, so that even if if there is an issue with one data source, because of the complementary nature of these data sources, it's unlikely that there will be the same error appearing in 2 different data sources. So as a good rule of thumb to follow is to look for evidence of outages in at least 2 data sources. All right, okay, so what we've learned in this presentation so far is you can use anybody on the internet, the public can access the IODA system and look at the graphs to investigate potential shutdown events. And some of these shutdown events are very clearly visible, like the ones in Syria, like the ones in Ethiopia, and also the ones in Iran. Some of the shutdowns are visible, but they need a more practiced eye to look at. And we also went over some of the pitfalls in interpreting IODA data. The data is available publicly, and of course, we are trying to not have as many. We're trying to reduce these pitfalls, and we're making good progress towards it. But at the same time, when you're using IODA for interpreting the data, just keep these pitfalls in mind. And with that, I'm ready to take questions. I'm also happy to dig into specific cases that you'd be interested in.
Thanks for that demo, Rama. It's really interesting stuff. I'll remind everybody who's watching this live now that you can, as you probably know, you can leave questions in the pad. The link is on the screen below. You might also leave questions in the Uni channel on Slack. It is also bridged with the IRC or directly in the live chat below. As Rama was mentioning before, also if you have some specific events or cases that you would like him to live demo and investigate using IODA, that's also another great thing to bring up. So we have a first suggestion, which comes from somebody from IRC, I think. Okay. And their question is looking into Hurricane Irma in Puerto Rico on 2017 09 September 7th of September 2017.
7th of September 2017. Okay, so let's take a look. So country would be Puerto Rico, and let's take a look at plus or minus 1 week. Because Irma, I remember, did massive damage to Puerto Rico, so I imagine that the outage lasted much longer. But let's see, so September 17th, you said, right? So let's look at September 10th until September 24th. All right, let's see what IODA has to say. So with Puerto Rico, since it's it's a smaller country, and therefore it is possible that it won't be. We may not see a very, very clear drop like the kinds that we saw in Iran. But yeah, let's see what IODA has to say. Okay, so example of here are 2 examples of missing data, BGP and IBR. But there's also the clear drop in active probing. Right on, so this looks like September 20th at 5:30. Is that consistent with when the worst of the damage happened during Iran, during Irma?
So actually, I believe
so. Yeah.
September 7, not 10.
Oh, I see. My apologies. Okay, let's see.
Getting from.
Let's take a look at all of September. Maybe that would be good.
And when you're running these, this what backend is this connecting to? Like, it must be doing a bunch of crunching as you're running like this query.
Exactly. There's a lot of crunching that happens. Let's see. We used to have really nice architecture diagram, project info, I think. Yeah. So for people who are interested, this shows it in some fairly in some fair detail. Let me quickly switch back to. Oh, okay. So
oh wow, it even detected it.
Yes. So in the active probing data source, it's fairly clear, and looks like there was a separate event that occurred over here, which maybe while the recovery was occurring, there was again a massive outage that happened here. But definitely on the 7th, you can see that the active probing data source. And one more thing to note is during these hurricane outages, what we've typically observed, as opposed to the internet censorship events that we see, or that we've looked at so far, in a censorship event, often there is like a binary, it's an instantaneous drop. So it's as though the network just goes boom, it just goes down, as it was a switch that is flipped. Whereas with these types of hurricane-related outages, what ends up happening is that there typically isn't a single massive outage, unless like a huge power plant or something has an outage. But instead, as the hurricane does damage over the course of that day, different networks around this aggregate, they go down. So you can see that there is a significant drop, but it wasn't just one one massive drop, but instead it's spread out, a little more spread out.
Interesting.
Yeah, but yes, so coming back to the architecture diagram, and again, so feel free to paste more events that you like to take a look at. But in the meantime, I'm just going to answer to this question. So we take all of our different data sources, so that we get from BGP and the network telescope at UCSD. That's the source for our internet background radiation, or unfortunately named Darknet traffic. And also the active probing, so the ping data that we get, that we obtain using the trinocular methodology. So all of these, they go through they're inserted into time series databases. So we use something called DBATs, and then we use Kafka to obtain automatic alerts. So the DBATs is where the time series are stored, and then Kafka actually gets the alerts from the DBATs databases by crunching through them. And then we have the chart house is what the UI is built upon.
Nice. Yeah. Thanks for that. That's a great explanation, and we can add the link to the in the video description as well, so that people can follow up on that.
Absolutely, yes.
So we've been receiving several questions from IRC and the Slack channel. So Amir says, how many vantage points are under IODA control, distributed around the world? In how many countries ASs?
Okay, so I'm going to answer this as it depends upon which data source we are talking about. Okay, so let's start with the simplest data source to describe. Active probing, there is one vantage point. We have one vantage point that's in San Diego Supercomputer Center, where CAIDA is located. It's UC San Diego. That's probing across the world. For BGP, we actually obtain the data is obtained from BGP routers all around the world. These are called BGP collectors. In fact, the help page has a lot more information about these particular sources. So we obtain data from route views and write-res. These are two different BGP collection projects, which collect data from BGP table data and BGP updates from BGP speaking routers that participate with these collector programs. And for the network telescope, it's a lot. It's the hardest to answer in some ways, because we have a large network where hosts from all around the world which are just sending us this this background noise traffic. So this traffic consists of malware. So for example, one of the big contributors to this traffic was BitTorrent traffic. So some BitTorrent clients, they believed that they had neighbors in the network telescope, in the address space used by the network telescope. And so they would send us BitTorrent traffic, and that would allow us to observe that, okay, if a computer from Iran is sending us BitTorrent traffic, it then allows us to say, okay, that computer has a working internet connection, which is why it's sending us traffic. Now, one way to get a sense for how many different IP addresses, because that's what we count, are sending us data. So let's take a look at Iran during that time. So Iran in November again. And so here, recall that all of these signals were normalized between 0 and 1. But if we actually want to get a sense for the raw count of the IP addresses that are actually reaching the darknet, you just turn off this normalized and see the absolute values. And then if we just focus on the darknet traffic, it allows us to see that on average, in the entire aggregate of Iran, we're seeing around 3,600 IP addresses from Iran that were sending us traffic. So note that there is some cleaning that we do of this traffic, but it's after cleaning the signal, we see between 2,200 to 4,000 IP addresses before the shutdown.
Great, thanks for that. We have many questions in the pad. I see several people have left a lot of good ones. So we have another one coming from Ram, and the question is, which of your data sources have been most useful in the past? Is there one that you gave a clearer signal of a shutdown than others?
Okay. So that's a really good question. The way I would answer that. Let's answer that in terms of confidence. So if there is a shutdown in BGP, if we observe a really large drop in BGP, typically in all the graphs that I've been showing you, I don't know if you've seen this, but BGP tends to be the most stable. So when there's a drop in the BGP signal, we are more confident that that's actually an outage and that could be indicative of that's consistent with shutdowns. But just because BGP works doesn't always mean that there continues to be internet connectivity, and it really depends upon the mechanisms that countries have used. So sometimes, like I think in one of the graphs that I showed you for one of the ASs actually in Iran, so AS1 to one of the ITCs, there wasn't actually a drop in BGP, although there was a drop in active probing and Darknet. And so really, I wouldn't, there isn't a clear signal which is always giving us like, this is the go-to signal that you should use if you want to detect shutdowns. We would, in my experience, it's been that these three signals together are actually painting a more complete picture. And I would actually say not just these three, the more signals we have, the better. And in fact, we're working towards obtaining additional signals where possible in order to shed light on some events that we currently do not observe. So one thing that I actually meant to say in the presentation, but now is a good time to bring up. Sometimes IODA does not have very good visibility into cellular outages. So sometimes we do, like in Iran, during this particular event, we were able to see the outages in cellular networks as well. But oftentimes, because of technologies that cellular networks use, like carrier-grade NAT, we don't actually have, these current data sources don't have good visibility into those networks. And so we are continuously trying to hone and improve IODA so that we can add data sources that can capture shutdowns in cellular networks as well.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. So we have another question, comes from Baz. And the question is, has the network telescope monitoring the /8 block ever failed? I imagine there are maintenance challenges for such a big platform. Can you elaborate on them?
Oh yeah. Okay, yes. So the short version is yes. I think in the graph that I already showed you, there were several gaps in those data because, as you mentioned, it's a massive infrastructure, and in spite of all of our efforts, and know that we've continuously been improving our efforts to deal with the scale of that data and to not lose the data, and we've definitely been getting better at it. We're getting better at it, especially in the recent past. In spite of that, sometimes we do face infrastructure outages. But the larger problem, especially in the context of IODA, is sometimes when the aggregates are small. Like if you're looking at a large country like Iran, then the Darknet data source, we were just looking at the absolute numbers. There are quite a few addresses over here, so that it's possible to detect these drops. But sometimes for smaller aggregates, like if we were to look at a region within Iran or at a network within Iran, the Darknet data source, it already has these fluctuations due to diurnal patterns. It can sometimes have fluctuations due to other reasons. And it's a little harder to extract outages, to extract true positives in the network telescope data, in the Darknet data in particular. So while it's an amazing resource that we have at UC San Diego, it's not a panacea. It's really good, and we are actually currently developing techniques to improve our detection on the network telescope. But it's there's an outage, there's a gap even there. So yes, we do have some infrastructure problems every now and then.
Fair enough. Thanks for that answer. So we have another question, comes from Ram. Have you thought about other forms of active probing, maybe TCP? Isn't ICMP blocked on many networks?
Well, that is true. ICMP is blocked on many networks, and we have certainly thought of other forms of probing. But okay, TCP probing is often considered to be abusive. In my personal experience, when I've tried TCP probing, I've received more abuse reports from users than compared to ICMP. And there's actually been a research study published on which of these protocols tend to get blocked or tend to get the most abuse reports. And since we are running a system that's running continuously across the world, we would like to do it in an ethical and polite manner. So that's one of the reasons why we are for now stuck to ICMP. But yes, we are definitely looking at other systems, more fine-grained, larger, at increasing the granularity with which we're doing our active probing. Arturo, I can't hear you. Sorry. I just lost audio.
Great. So another question comes from Baz. I imagine IODA's data could also be used to look.
Okay, I lost Arturo. I'm hoping. Let me see if I can fill up the chat. So this is I really want to say thanks so much for these questions. Thanks for all the interest. I'm really glad that you're able to participate and take a look even these times. And I know that especially for many of you, this is July 3rd and it's a holiday, and it's a Friday, or it's late on Friday. Thank you so much for participating. Okay, so I think I'm with the question. I think I should have meant to say, here's a question number 5. I imagine IODA's data. So there's a question from Baz. IODA's data. Okay,
I'm back maybe.
Yes,
can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay, cool. Yeah, I think the demo gods are always there, like lurking, and yeah. But I think it's back. So yeah, I was just asking you that Baz asked the question. I imagine IODA's data could also be used to look at different ISPs' quality of service. And if you have observed correlation between the number of outages and a certain type of link, such as a satellite or DSL.
That's actually, okay, it's a great question. And the short answer is we haven't done that with IODA data, but there was, I will paste a link to a paper that we recently wrote, which was using active probing and which was observing the differences in how, say, DSL and satellite links, how they get affected by different types of weather. And it's a great future direction that we intend to take a look at. There is definitely the intuition that you have is right. Satellite networks tend to get affected by a lot more outages than DSL networks, and this is actually pretty visible in the active probing data source.
Great.
I can post a link to the paper.
Yeah, we can leave all the links in the video description after the.
I see. Okay.
Or if you have the chat available, why not? I don't.
Oh yeah. I can just let me just paste it here.
So we have another question that comes from Tanzel. Can you please talk a bit about internet shutdown in Kashmir and how it is imposed? It seems that I'm connected to 4G, but the bandwidth is limited to 2G.
Okay, so I'm actually glad you asked me that question, because that is one of the things that IODA data is not the most appropriate for. So what IODA shows is whether there was an internet outage or not, using its different data sources, but it does not say what the cause was. So we don't even know necessarily that an outage is due to a shutdown event, or if it's due to a power outage event, or due to just a network misconfiguration event. So in the case of Kashmir, the reason why we were able to say that, okay, these IODA signals are likely, so what we're able to say is that these IODA signals are consistent with a shutdown in Kashmir, but they may also be consistent with a with a really, really, really long power outage in Kashmir, if that's supposed to have happened. But we know that there wasn't, that kind of an event did not happen, and we do know instead that a government mandated shutdown did happen around the same time when we saw the signals drop in IODA. Okay, and the other question was, so how is it imposed, right? So because we don't know, because the IODA data is not meant to answer whether an outage is due to a shutdown, it's hard to say how the mechanism with which it was imposed. Sometimes it's possible to use the signals in IODA, the drop in the signals in IODA, to perhaps imagine scenarios, to consider scenarios which could have been used, but there is no authoritative data in IODA which we can definitely say, okay, this particular shutdown event was caused by method X, or this other shutdown was caused by method Y. That's not, that wasn't the goal of IODA.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. Oh, and the bandwidth is limited to 2G. Sorry, I just saw that question. IODA does not look at bandwidth throttling. It looks at episodes of complete internet outages. That is where a user is unable to, where a large fraction of users are unable to connect to the internet entirely.
Right. So we have another question coming from Dave. Great work. I particularly like the need to validate outages with more than one measurement. What if you have multiple measurements that say there is outage and multiple that say that there isn't?
This is a really good question, and something that in the outage detection measurement world we run into constantly. So there often isn't ground truth available, and therefore, in the absence of ground truth, to some extent, all bets are off. But the right way forward, and the way that we are trying to assess is, if we can construct ground truth for a few events and then observe which of these, which signals are more consistently performing better, or more consistently accurate with ground truth, then that is giving us some evidence as that those are the data sources that are perhaps a little more authoritative compared to other data sources. But again, that's a bit of a there are some caveats there, because like BGP, an outage in BGP may be it may be highly accurate and sensitive. It may be very accurate at detecting an outage, but some outages may not manifest in BGP at all, depending upon the mechanism. So there isn't an easy or a simple answer to this. It's more of, we need to do a lot more work, ideally with ground truth, to assess the accuracy of these different techniques before we can have a concrete answer to the question.
Great. Another question comes from Norman. Are there other data sources publicly available, or is it only those three CAIDA is using?
So, for example, I guess I'm not really sure how Norman has used the term data sources, but what I'll say is there are other tools similar to IODA. For example, there is Oracle's tool, Oracle's Internet Intelligence tool, which also, like IODA, it uses a set of different data sources, and the dashboard at least is publicly available. There are significant differences between the two. I think in Oracle's Internet Intelligence tool, you can only go back at you can only look at the last week's worth of data, and you can only look at specific you can't look at regions, I believe. And there are differences in the data sources as well, which due to time reasons I'm not going to cover. But there does exist Oracle's Internet Intelligence, and I think there is also Google Transparency Report, which has some data on internet outages that is accessible to anybody. So,
great. So we have another question coming from Juan. Census does TCP probing for the whole internet every day. Have you considered integrating their data? As you mentioned, TCP probing may be considered as abusive, unethical. Can you point to the paper that discusses this problem? And if it's unethical, how platforms like Census and Shodan justify what they're doing until today?
Okay, no, that's a great question. So I don't consider them necessarily to be unethical, or it's not a question of whether I consider them unethical. It's a question of what is perceived as unethical by network administrators, because they're the ones who often send these abuse reports. So in fact, if you look at the ZMAP paper, the original ZMAP paper, they discuss receiving abuse reports, and they discuss their efforts at handling them in a they discuss guidelines on how to handle these and how to do these massive scanning operations, not just over TCP, even over ICMP. They say that you should have a project page that's publicly available and that describes the kinds of measurements that you're doing. And related to the first question, which is a paper that shows that discusses this problem. So there was work by John Heidemann, I believe it's called Census and Survey of the Visible Internet, where they looked at which protocols tend to yield more responses. And they found that ICMP was actually the protocol over which where the responses were least likely to be blocked. So I can post a link to that paper in the pad if that's
nice. Yeah. Okay, and we can even add it as a video description.
Oh no, that's not. So that link is not a. It doesn't work that we did. So I think I'm specifically answering the question of, can you point to the paper that discusses?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, they leave their thank you. They thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's about the time we had for questions. I would like to thank you again so much, Rama, for joining us today and sharing the great work that you and your team are doing at IODA. I would also like to thank your colleagues for you and the whole IODA team for the really important work that you folks are doing in advancing the space. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. And I should also give a huge shout out to my PI Alberto Dinardi, who so he had the vision for this project, and he's been working on this since 2011. And he was one of the authors of that original paper that was looking at shutdowns in Egypt and Libya during the Arab Spring. And Alistair King, who's the wizard behind this entire IODA and the IODA dashboard. And also, yes, we have a lot of people who are actively working on IODA, and huge shout out to all of them. But I also wanted to say thank you so much, Arturo and Maria, and thanks to Uli for organizing this amazing Internet Measurement Village. It's been a pleasure, and I'm really glad you gave us this opportunity.
Well, thank you again, Rama. Thank you again. Thank you. So I would, at this point, like to thank everybody for, because as I mentioned in the beginning, this is the last day of the Internet Measurement Village. Yeah, it's been really a true pleasure to be your host for these 3 weeks of the Internet Measurement Village. We've had a really amazing lineup of presentations from some really important projects. We've had groups investigating internet censorship in basically every continent of the world. We've had developers that build tools to circumvent internet censorship. And we've also been honored of hosting so many great projects that measure internet censorship to uncover evidence of network interference. So I would really like to invite you all, either if you're watching this live or even in the future, to just think back at all these great projects that you've seen during this course of sessions, and just think about them and express your gratitude and thank them and send them all this great and positive energy. We really feel so proud to be part of this community and thankful for so much we are able to learn from each other. I would also like to thank all the other projects and initiatives that are fighting for digital human rights and internet freedom all around the world that unfortunately were not able to be part of this event. We missed many, unfortunately, because the time is limited, but all our support and loves goes to them as well. Lastly, I would like to thank everybody who watched these videos and participated in the live stream with comments and questions. Your positive energy and good vibes, I could feel it. It's palpable. So really, thank you so much. We're considering that this could maybe not be the last Internet Measurement Village or similar type events that we will organize. We're thinking of doing more of them again in the future. So we would like to ask you one last thing, which is, if you can, please share your feedback in the survey that you see below the link. We will also add the link in the comment and in the video description. So we can make it even more epic and make another great event. So thank you very much again, everybody, and yeah, have a great weekend and have fun.